Okay, so hello and welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since we made a little video for obvious reasons. The world has sort of fell apart since we last made a video, so I'm going to try and get back on track here with a quick video about something that you can do from home whilst in quarantine without breaking any rules, without putting anyone in danger, and that is photo editing. I'm going to take you through the sort of things you need to know if you're just making subtle, small adjustments to a photo, the kind of things you want to know to shoot for, the kind of things you want to avoid, and maybe a few little stylistic things you can add to your photos as well. So the software I use and what I'm going to be showing you today is Adobe Lightroom. This comes as part of the Adobe Creative Cloud package, and you get all of their software, including Premiere and everything like that, for one price per month in this package. The Adobe Cloud is not cheap, so I completely understand that not everyone can use this kind of software. However, for Adobe Lightroom, there is a mobile app which is free as well, so that might be an option if you're taking photos on your iPhone, and the settings are actually all very similar, which is great for going back and forth from one to the other or just using the mobile app. You can get the app on an iPad, a Chromebook, any kind of device like that as well, which is fantastic if you want to do editing on a slightly bigger screen. If you can get your photos from a camera to your iPhone, for example, then you're in the money. You can start doing it on your phone for free. Okay, so now that we've moved literally about 10 inches from the sofa to the chair, let's jump straight into Lightroom. I'm going to open up some photos. I'm trying to get a nice range in there, and we're going to start editing these photos just with some basic tips and tricks. Okay, so here's a good example of one that's not great out of the box. This photo is a little bit overexposed, as you can see, so what we're going to try and do is edit this to get it back to being a good level of quality. So taking a look at this photo, there's a few things wrong with this to start with. As I mentioned, it's massively overexposed. This up here should be color, it should be a nice level, and it's far too bright. If you take a look at the scopes over here, the histogram, you can actually see this top corner is far too high. You're getting a big spike in that corner. That means that your whites are too high. So the first thing we'll do is we'll try and bring the exposure, the overall exposure, down a tiny bit. That should help. Yeah, so that's already brought in a bit of this highlight back. But what we want to do is try and dial them in specifically. So rather than just affect the overall exposure, we're going to go into the highlight section and just pull these down. In a photo like this, we can probably pull these right down. As I pull this down, you can see a little bit of a detail coming back into this top sky section. It's probably a little bit not enough still, so we're going to try and bring exposure down a tiny bit more. Sometimes you need to bear in mind that if a photo is taken badly, if it's not exposed correctly in the first place, that detail might be gone. It might be blown out. You might not be able to get it back, but you can have a look on your scopes and see whether or not that's something you can fix. So this photo is already looking a lot better than it was to start with. So what we're going to just do now is keep going through these little dials and dial in some more of these details. So as we brought the exposure down, the shadows probably have come down a little bit much as well. They're actually still in. If you look at the histogram, there's nothing clipping, but we might just want to push them back up a tiny bit just to bring us some more of this detail back into the jack on our subject. Now for me, that's actually already at a much nicer level than it was to start with, so we're just going to have a quick mess around with the other settings just to see what we can do. A nice suggestion is just to actually put these dials up and down on a photo just to see what it's doing. It's a really good way of learning what is happening in a photo and what they're affecting. Obviously some of them are quite self-explanatory, like the shadows and things like that, but you know, whites aren't always quite as easy to pick out. So if you pull that right down, you're going to see what it does there. You're going to see it bring that detail back into the sky, which for a photo like this is really what I want. Again, with the blacks, they're the sort of the bottom end of the shadows, so if you pull them down too far, you're going to contrast the image, which some people like. Sometimes that's a kind of stylistic choice, but personally I'm not a massive fan of, so we're just going to bring them back until we see on the histogram that it stays in and we're back in, we're not clipping any blacks out. If you come into this presence tab here, you've got texture, clarity, dehaze. So these are all things you want to kind of be careful with using too much, as you can definitely go overboard on these ones. So again, if I show you what they do, if you bring the texture down, it's just going to kind of smooth out everything in this image, which can give quite a nice stylistic effect. If you go the other way, it's going to kind of pop everything. If you're shot on an iPhone or something that doesn't have a lot of detail in the first place, these texture sliders can actually be quite useful. Even that as a photo, for me, is still usable and actually might, in some cases, be the kind of effect you want. If you go to the clarity section, again, if you bring that down, you're going to sort of start smoothing off the edges. You can get quite a nice sort of dreamlike effect. If I push that the other way, you're going to start sort of crunching everything and making everything really textured. Again, sometimes people like this. You see a lot of this on Instagram. Personally, I think this can be overused, and you do see this in a lot of photographers' photos, that the texture and the clarity is just a little bit too high for me. So we can bring that down again. Sometimes I like bringing it down just a little bit just to kind of smooth off those edges. Dehaze does what it says on the tin. If there's any haze in your photo, it's going to try and cut through it, but 9 times out of 10 I find this is a slider you don't want to touch too much. It doesn't really add anything or take anything away. Vibrance and saturation can be a little bit tricky as they're often kind of seen as the same thing. There are subtle differences. I'm not getting into the color science of what the differences are, but color vibrance will pull out the colors and make your image punchier. Saturation will do that, but on a grander scale. It'll kind of do it across all the colors in your image and it'll make bigger, more drastic changes. So let's take a look. If I pull the saturation tab up on this, you're instantly going to see all the colors pop more, which can have a nice effect. But on an image like this, where the colors are already quite pronounced, you can see very, very quickly that becomes a little bit silly and unrealistic. That is not what the real world looks like ever. If you go the other way, you're going to start getting towards a kind of moody, distilled black and white image. So pull that back to the middle. What I tend to do instead is look at the vibrance slider. If I pull the vibrance up, you're going to get the colors in and you're going to add a lot more color into those tones, but until you get very high up on that scale, you're still actually in quite a nice realistic level. So even bringing it up to about 50, personally I still think that's usable and I still think that's quite a nice image. Go too far, again, you start to see colors which just don't look like you see them in the real world. And bring that down, again, you're going to go into black and white. So with vibrance and saturation, you just need to play around with each one. I tend to use vibrance as it's a little bit easier to manage. So for an image like this, the only other things I'd probably look at if I was doing a basic grade would be lens corrections if the camera needs them. So my camera and this software will automatically detect this lens as it's electronic, and it adds any kind of distortion changes on there. If you take it off, you can see what the image is without it. So it's definitely worth having that on to create a nice image. If you go into the effects tab, which is already open, you can add a vignette, which I do quite a lot. It is quite nice, does kind of draw attention to your subject. That can be something quite nice to do. Just make sure they're not too harsh and you can feather them further if needs to be. And then if you wanted to add any photo grain for a sort of filmic look, then you can start pushing this slider up. Again, it's a look that you see a lot and it can be nice, but you want to be careful not to overdo it or overuse it, as I feel like that looks like you've whacked an Instagram filter on it, not done a professional edit on the photo. Okay, so what I've done here is I opened up another image, a very different image. This is quite a sort of stylized image we took at a sunset with a sort of LED neon mask. So this edit will be quite different. Now, this is not a perfect photo because as you can see, it's actually the background that's in focus and not my subject. That wasn't necessarily intentional and isn't necessarily something you'd want to do in a photo, but I'm going to use this as an example of how to further edit your photos and crop them into different styles. So the first thing I'm going to show you here is some of these filter sections up here. So if you click on our adjustment brush up here, it's going to bring up this new sort of adjustment layer here. Mine is automatically set to exposure, so actually we're going to leave it on that for now, as what I'm going to try and do is brighten up the subject. So if I now paint over the subject, you're going to see it slightly brighten up this part of the image and nothing else. So it's only going to edit what the tool is that is actually highlighted. This can be great for bringing out a subject in a photo or, just brightening up a certain section of the image within Lightroom. Now, if the edges have gone a little bit too far, which mine have, you can use your mouse wheel to kind of scroll down, make that smaller, click erase, and then just kind of paint back over that section because you don't want to be going outside the subject as it will start to look like an obvious crop there. So now in Lightroom, on this mask section, you've got all your settings for the mask you've just done. So rather than having it do it for the whole image, if we now pull the contrast up, it's only going to do it on that section. Again, this gives us a lot of control over what we do in the image. So I'm going to bring the exposure down a tiny bit as I felt that was a little bit over the top. And then we can really kind of start to play around with this until we get something that we really like. So again, if we can push the saturation within this image, that's going to give us a really nice pop on the neon colors. We can add some clarity to bring them back, although in this case it's going to look horrible, so let's pull that right down. And then we've got sharpness, noise, etc. in there. So if we click on the mask again, it's going to get rid of that and go back to our overall image. So the last thing I'm going to show you today is just the crop feature in Lightroom. So if I click on crop overlay up here, it brings up this little box here. So you can either lock the aspect ratio into a certain size. Some of these are already set for the kind of things you might want to use. So we've got 4x5, which is for Instagram, 16:9, which is a film, etc., etc. Or you can take that lock off and you can just make it yourself. So if we go to 4x5, which is the default Instagram setting, I believe, move this around and get this to what we want it to be. Again, this image is not perfect in terms of the way it's shot, so the crop isn't going to be spot on either way. So we just clicked on there and then we've got a very different image now, which really punched in, and we've got some sort of stylization on this bit. And that will do for that photo. The last thing I'm going to show you today is how to use presets in Lightroom. You can purchase presets on the internet. I don't sell any, but there's a lot of creators, YouTubers and photographers that do sell them online, and they really can take your photos to a next level with very, very little editing involved. So let's take a look now at some presets which I've purchased. Okay, so in the presets tab over on the left here, you can see you've got the ones that come with Lightroom by default, which to be honest for me are always a bit useless, and then we've got some presets which I've added in over the years. So in this tab here, we've got some sort of vintage ones, which can be quite nice if you're going for a vintage look. You can see, sort of like on Instagram, you can see how these instantly have a massive effect on the image and sometimes are just kind of what you need. And we've got some more presets in here, and as I scroll down, you can see a real difference, a real change in these. I don't want to understate how important and how useful these can be when you're first starting out. Obviously, you want to have some control over your image and you don't want to rely on a preset, but these can be a great starting point, and there's some really, really good ones out there. And then I've got some Peter McKinnon ones in here, for example, which I'm going to open up. And then we've got some of my favorites like Peter McKinnon's Dolomite one, which is fantastic. And then we've got his Red Crush, which kind of completely changes the color tone in the image. What I'd advise to do with presets is start with one and then make adjustments yourself. So if I come down to Pirate Life, which I know is one that I quite like, that it actually adds the adjustments from the preset onto the image so you can still play with them. So what I'm instantly going to do is pull that grain back off because that's a very stylized grain and I don't want that. Then we're going to go on to detail and we're going to try to pull the sharpening back as well because again, don't want that. This image is a little bit noisy, so I'm going to sort of pull some noise reduction on just to kind of flatten out these parts of the image, and then we can literally make any more adjustments that we want. So you can see that image was quite blown out, so I quite like the highlights being really low. The shadows to bring the detail out probably do need to be higher, so on something like that it's actually kind of made the adjustments I want already. It's probably brought saturation down a bit, which again is probably a good thing because it's a very saturated sunset image. These kind of tips and tricks can really take you from the lowest level beginner sort of stuff right up until you're kind of working on professional photos. The methods behind this kind of stuff don't really change, they just get a bit more in depth, a little bit more intricate, and obviously you'll know more and more about what it is you're actually doing in the software. Okay, so thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back next time where we jump into something else that we can all do from home whilst we're in lockdown. See you then.